My name is Tahoma Whitecloud, and I came to the Idaho backcountry the way most men come to a place like that. I came because I had nowhere else to go. The ranch was the first thing to leave me. My father held a quarter section in Lemhi County for 31 years, and when he died, the cattle held it for another 2. Then the disease came through the herd in the summer I turned 28, and the bank held what was left for about 6 weeks before they took even that. I signed the papers on the porch where I had learned to walk. The lawyer used a clipboard. He kept apologizing, and I kept telling him there was nothing to apologize for, which was a lie I had been telling everyone since the funeral. I owed money to 4 people and a federal program. I had a degree in forestry I had never properly used. A man I had worked summers with told me the Park Service was hiring for the River of No Return Wilderness, that they needed bodies for the deep stations because nobody wanted to sit 40 miles from the nearest road eating freeze-dried stroganoff. He said the housing was included, the salary was federal, and you could not spend $1 in the place even if you wanted to. That last part sold it. I packed what fit in the truck and drove south through the Salmon River Canyon in a snow that came down sideways and never quite landed. The senior ranger at McCall told me his name was Halloran and that he would be my supervisor for the season. He had a face like a hand that had been left out in the weather, and he did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the wall behind me, at the map of the wilderness pinned to it with rusted thumbtacks. 2.3 million acres, largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48 outside of Alaska. Halloran ran his finger along the middle fork of the Salmon and stopped at a dot below the Big Creek confluence. "That is your station," he said. "Cabin, woodshed, generator, latrine, river out the front door, trail out the back, but the trail goes nowhere you want to walk in a hurry. We supply you by bush plane every 2 weeks, weather depending. The radio is hand-cranked backup and a solar VHF. You will not get cell service. You will not get internet. You may get lonely. That is not my problem." I asked him what was my problem then. "Hunters," he said. "Lost hikers, rafters who put in on the Middle Fork without checking their permits, bears that have learned what a granola bar is, and the people who already live out there who you are not going to find on any map but who exist anyway." I asked him what he meant by that last part. He looked at me for the first time. He had the kind of pale eyes that always seem to be deciding whether you are worth the trouble of an answer. "There are people who went into the wilderness before it was a wilderness," he said. "Old miners, trappers, men who built cabins in 1948 and never came out. Their kids sometimes. Their kids' kids. The Wilderness Act of '64 did not pry them loose. We mostly leave them alone, and they mostly leave us alone. But you may run across one. If you do, you are polite, you are brief, and you do not turn your back on him until the trees are between you. Do you understand me, Whitecloud?" I said I did. I did not. The bush plane took me in on a Tuesday in the second week of June. The pilot was a woman who flew without speaking and landed on a gravel bar that did not look long enough to land on. She dropped my supplies in the mail bag, told me she would see me in 14 days unless the smoke came in early, and lifted off again in the time it took me to shoulder the duffel. The drone of her engine bent around the canyon walls for a long time after she was gone. Then it was just the river. The cabin sat back from the bank under a stand of ponderosa pine. The logs were silver with age. The roof was new tin, painted forest green to keep it invisible from the air. A woodshed leaned against the north wall, full of split lodgepole. The latrine sat 50 yards uphill behind a screen of huckleberry. The generator squatted in its own little shed under a tarp. Halloran had told me to use the generator only for the radio battery and the fridge, and only when the solar would not handle it. Everything else I would do by lamp. I spent the first 3 days walking my sector. I checked the cache sites, the campground registration boxes, the toilet pits at the established camps along the river. I introduced myself to one rafting party putting in at the Indian Creek Guard Station upstream, took down their permit numbers, told them where the next emergency cache was, watched them push off into the green water. I did not see another human face for the next 11 days. What I noticed first was the silence. The Middle Fork is not a silent river. It runs over a boulder field most of its length, and the sound carries up into the cabin like the breathing of something very large. But underneath the river, the wilderness is quiet in a way I had never properly experienced. There is no engine noise, no distant highway, no power line hum. At night you can hear the timbers in the cabin walls contracting as the air cools, and you can hear, very far off, the bugle of a bull elk or the laughter of coyotes. There is no other layer. Whatever sound is there, that is all there is. I read the manuals. I cleaned the rifle. I learned the names of the side creeks on my map: Pistol, Loon, Marble, Brush. I learned which trails were maintained and which had been abandoned by the Park Service after the fire in 2007. I noted that the abandoned trails did not go nowhere. They went somewhere. They went to cabins and mining claims that had been there before the wilderness designation, and the agency had simply stopped maintaining the access. The cabins were still on the maps as private inholdings. Most of them, Halloran had said, were empty now. Most. On the 13th day, I went to the food cache I kept in a steel locker bolted to a pine 50 yards behind the cabin. I had stocked it that morning with the supplies the pilot had brought. When I opened it that evening to retrieve a can of beef stew, 3 things were missing: a pound of coffee, a bag of dried beans, a tin of bacon grease. The locker showed no claw marks. The hasp was not broken. I had latched the door that morning, and the door was latched still. The padlock I had not bothered to set because Halloran had told me bears do not use keys and people out here do not steal. I stood looking at the locker for a long time before I closed it. I told myself I had miscounted. I told myself the pilot had shorted me, that the inventory was wrong. I went back to the cabin and ate the stew cold out of the can, and I left the lamp burning until very late. The call came over the VHF on the morning of my 15th day. Halloran's voice, clipped and tinny, asking for my position and status. 2 hikers had been reported overdue out of the Indian Creek trailhead. A woman named Adelaide Pike and her partner Brennan Voss, both from Boise, both experienced, both expected back at the trailhead on the 11th. Today was the 15th. The county sheriff was opening a search and rescue. Park Service personnel were being asked to grid their assigned sectors on foot. My sector covered the Middle Fork drainage from Marble Creek to Big Creek, including the abandoned trail up Pistol Creek. I copied the message twice to be sure I had it, then read it back. Halloran told me to take a 48-hour pack, a satellite beacon, and the rifle. He told me to stay on the established grid pattern. He told me not, under any circumstances, to deviate up a side drainage unless I had hard evidence of the subject's presence. I asked him what counted as hard evidence. He said I would know it when I saw it. I left at 8 in the morning with my pack and my radio and the rifle slung across my back. The day was clear and the air had a pine smell that came up through the heat. I worked the river trail upstream for the first 3 hours, scanning the bank for the kind of debris that an injured hiker leaves behind without meaning to. A water bottle, a foam pad, the wrapper of an energy gel. I found nothing. The trail in that stretch is well used by rafters portaging gear, and any sign would have been wiped within a day. By noon, I had reached the mouth of Pistol Creek. The Park Service trail up Pistol had been closed for 15 years, since a fire took out 2 bridges and most of the lower switchbacks. I checked my map. The grid did not require me to go up Pistol Creek. The grid required me to continue another 2 miles upstream to the next established camp. But the missing hiker's permit had listed Pistol Creek as a possible route. Adelaide Pike had told a friend on the phone that she wanted to look at the old Caswell mine ruins, which were 3 miles up the drainage. Halloran had said no deviation without hard evidence. I told myself a permit was not evidence. I told myself I was going to walk 100 yards up the creek and turn back. 100 yards in, I found the bandage. It was the cheap kind that comes in a first aid kit, white gauze on an adhesive back, and it lay in the trail with the gauze side up. There was a brown stain on it the size of a quarter. The blood had dried. I called it in. Halloran took my coordinates and told me to proceed up the drainage with maximum caution, to report every 30 minutes, and to turn back if I lost line of sight on the radio repeater on Agapa Mountain. I went up. The trail was bad. Whole sections had slid out into the creek. I had to scramble across talus where the switchbacks had collapsed, and twice I waded the creek itself because there was no other way around a deadfall jam. I called in at the half hour. I called in at the hour. The radio held. At a mile and a half up, I came across the camp. It was set in a flat under a stand of subalpine fir, set back from the creek by maybe 30 yards. A fire ring of dark stones. A tarp strung between 3 trees in a configuration I had never seen. The lines drawn taut with what looked like new paracord. A green plastic 5-gallon bucket, washed clean. A length of pale rope coiled neatly on a low rock. No tent, no sleeping bag, no food, no people. The fire ring was cold, but the stones were not weathered. The paracord was bright and unworn. The tarp had no pine needles on top of it, which meant it had been hung within the last week, perhaps within the last day. There was a packed dirt path leading from the fire ring back into the trees, in the direction away from the creek. This was not Pike and Voss's camp. They would have had a tent. They would have had packs. This was the camp of someone who lived nearby and used this flat as a satellite post. I called in. Halloran asked me to describe what I was seeing in detail, and I did. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "White Cloud, you back out of there right now. You back out the way you came in, and you do not look at the path going into the trees, and you do not go up that path. You come back to the river trail, and you sit there and you wait for me to send a helicopter for daylight pickup of that camp tomorrow morning." I asked him what was up that path. He said, "You back out right now." I backed out. I walked the mile and a half down Pistol Creek with the rifle off my shoulder and the safety off, and I kept turning around every few hundred yards to check the trail behind me. The trail behind me was always empty. The light coming through the firs was a thick, syrupy green. The creek noise covered every other sound. I have rarely been more afraid in my life, and I could not have told you what I was afraid of. I made the river trail at 4 in the afternoon. I made the cabin at 7. I locked the door and pulled the curtains across the 2 front windows for the first time since I had arrived. I called Halloran on the radio and confirmed I was in. He said the helicopter would come at first light. He said the search for Pike and Voss was being expanded to the upper Pistol drainage. He said, "Tahoma, listen to me. Stay inside tonight. You do not go to the latrine. You do not go to the woodshed. You do not go anywhere. You use a bucket. Do you copy?" I copied. The helicopter came at 6 in the morning. I watched it from the front porch as it came down the canyon, the rotors making that flat, heavy sound that bounces off rock walls. The pilot dropped 2 search and rescue specialists at the mouth of Pistol Creek and lifted off again to start a grid search of the upper drainage. The 2 specialists waved at me from across the river. I waved back. They started up the trail I had walked the day before. They found the camp. They found 3 more like it within a 2-mile radius, all set in flats above the creek, all unregistered, all recent. None had been the camp of Pike and Voss. They found in one of them a small wooden cross, made of 2 twigs lashed with copper wire, set upright in a cairn of river stones. They photographed it and they left it where it was. By dusk, the helicopter was gone again, and the 2 specialists had hiked out to the Indian Creek guard station. The search continued for 2 more days and was then scaled back to a single pilot doing aerial sweeps. No bodies, no packs, no further sign of Pike or Voss. The official theory at the office in McCall was that they had become disoriented in a side drainage, that they had run out of food and water, that they had succumbed somewhere too steep to be reached without a rope descent. The unofficial theory, Halloran told me on the radio, was that someone had moved them. He did not say who. The 4th night after the search, I was sleeping with the rifle across the foot of the bed when I woke up because I had heard my name. It came through the open window above the sink, very clear, very calm. A man's voice. It said Tahoma in the tone you would use to wake a friend who had fallen asleep in a chair. It said it twice, with a pause between, and then it was gone. I lay on the cot with my eyes open for a long time. The river ran, the cabin timbers contracted. There was no other sound. I told myself it had been a dream. I told myself the wind had moved through a crack in the chinking and made a noise that my sleeping mind had built into a syllable. I told myself a great many things that I did not believe. In the morning, I went out and I walked the perimeter of the cabin in widening circles, looking at the ground. I found 2 boot prints in the soft dirt by the latrine. They were not mine. They were a half size larger than my own boots, with a Vibram lug pattern I did not recognize. They pointed toward the cabin, not away from it. They were perhaps 8 hours old, which would have put them at about 3 in the morning. I called Halloran. I told him about the voice in the boot prints. He was quiet on the radio for a long time. Then he said, "White Cloud, I want you to get on the next supply flight out. I want you to come back to McCall. We will rotate someone else into your station." I said no. He said, "This is not optional." I said the next supply flight was not for 9 days. I said the season was 3 weeks from over. I said I had signed for a full rotation and I was going to finish it. I said all of this very calmly. The truth was that I did not know how to go back to McCall and look at the empty space where the next thing would not be. The truth was that I had spent 28 years on the ranch and I knew what it felt like to leave a place I should not have left, and I was not going to do it again. Halloran said, "Then you call me every 2 hours, day and night. If you miss a call, I send a helicopter. Do you copy?" I copied. That afternoon, I found the cairn. It was set on the trail behind the cabin, about 30 yards into the trees. 6 stones from the river, stacked smallest on top of largest, the way you would build any cairn anywhere. The stones were dry. The trail had been wet that morning from a passing shower. The cairn had been built within the last 4 hours. I knocked it down with my boot and kept walking. I went 100 yards up the trail and stopped and listened. The forest made forest sounds. A flicker called somewhere up the ridge. I went back to the cabin and I made a hot dinner on the propane stove, and I ate it sitting in the chair by the door with the rifle across my knees and the door bolted. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the chair and I watched the windows. The lamp burned low. At about 2 in the morning I heard the boot on the porch, the single soft step of a man trying to be quiet who has miscalculated the give of an old plank. I raised the rifle. I called out, "Identify yourself." There was no answer. I called out, "I have a rifle and I will use it. Identify yourself, or leave the porch." There was a long silence. Then I heard the footsteps go down the porch steps, slow and even, and I heard them cross the clearing toward the trail. I did not hear them stop. I waited an hour. Then I unbolted the door and I stepped onto the porch in my socks with the rifle up, and the clearing was empty and the trail was empty, and the moon was very high and very bright over the canyon, and I could see all the way down to the river. On the porch board nearest the door, set in the exact middle, was the pound of coffee that had gone missing from my cache. It had been opened. About half of it was gone. I called Halloran at 6 in the morning and told him everything. I told him about the coffee on the porch. I told him about the footsteps. I told him I was going to walk up Pistol Creek that day and look for the path I had been ordered not to look at. He told me no. I told him I was going anyway. I told him I had a federal employee's responsibility to the missing persons case and that I was going to do my job. I told him he could fire me when I got back. I think I meant it. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You take the satellite beacon, and you take a 48-hour pack, and you check in every 30 minutes. If you miss 2 checks in a row, the helicopter comes. Do you copy?" I copied. I left at 7. I walked the river trail up to Pistol Creek and turned north into the drainage. I passed the first camp where the tarp still hung. I passed the second, half a mile farther up, and the third, half a mile beyond that, where the small twig cross still stood in its little cairn. I went on. Past the third camp, the drainage narrowed and the trail climbed steeply through a band of granite cliffs. There was no Park Service trail here. There had not been one in 80 years, if there had ever been one at all. But there was a path. It was narrow and it was faint, and it had been kept open by someone who walked it often. The dirt was packed. The branches that crossed it had been broken back at exactly the height of a man's shoulder. I followed the path. At about a mile past the third camp, I came across the first of the blazes. They were carved into the bark of the lodgepole pines at a height of about 5 feet. They were not Park Service blazes. The Park Service marks trails with a diamond cut into the bark, simple and clean. These were different. They were a horizontal line crossed by 3 short vertical strokes, like a comb laid on its side. They were old, the cuts blackened with sap. There were more of them every 20 or 30 yards, all on the uphill side of trees, marking the path in a direction I was already following. The blazes had been refreshed within the last few years. Someone had taken a knife to them and reopened the cuts. I called Halloran. He told me to turn back. I did not turn back. A half-mile past the first blaze, I came over a low saddle and saw the cabin. It was tucked into a draw, set against the base of a granite outcrop so that 2 of its walls were stone. The roof was old shake, dark with moss. There was a chimney of mortared river rock. There was a small garden behind the cabin, with rows of what looked like potatoes and onions, the leaves green and healthy in the late summer sun. There was a clothesline strung between 2 pines, with a single gray shirt and a pair of gray wool pants hanging on it. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no sound. There was no person in sight. I stood at the edge of the trees for a long time. Then I called Halloran. I have located an inhabited inholding, I said. Cabin, garden, clothesline. No persons visible. What are my orders? Halloran said, you back out right now, White Cloud. You back out and you walk back down to the river and you do it without stopping. I am sending the helicopter to extract you from the mouth of Pistol Creek. Do you copy? I started to copy. I had the word in my mouth. Then I saw the packs. They were stacked against the woodpile on the side of the cabin. 2 of them, one blue, one red. They were dirty and they were torn at one of the shoulder straps, but they were intact. The blue one had a small piece of yellow tape on the top flap. The red one had a name written on the lid in black marker. I could see the name from where I stood. The marker said Pike. I told Halloran. I told him what I was looking at. I told him I was looking at the packs of Adelaide Pike and Brennan Voss, leaned against the woodpile of a private cabin 3.5 miles up Pistol Creek. Halloran said, Tahoma, listen to me very carefully. You back out right now. You do not approach that cabin. You do not look in the windows. You do not call out. You back out and you walk and you do it now. I said, where are the bodies? He said, Tahoma. I said, where are the bodies, Halloran? He said, we do not know yet that there are bodies. You back out, we will get the marshals on the radio. We will do this the right way. I backed out. I walked the 3.5 miles down the drainage with my rifle off my shoulder and the safety off and my hand sweating on the grip. I did not turn around for the first mile. Then I started to turn around. Every 50 yards I would stop and turn and look at the path behind me. I never saw anyone. The forest made forest sounds. The blazes I had been following uphill now sat on the downhill side of the trees and could not be seen from below, which is the way blazes work, and which means the man who refreshed them did not intend them to be followed in this direction. I made the river trail by 4 in the afternoon. The helicopter could not come. A weather front was pushing in from the southwest and the canyon was filling with cloud. The pilot had been waved off and would try again at first light. I made the cabin by 7. I bolted the door. I sat in the chair by the door with the rifle across my knees, and I waited. He came at midnight. He did not knock. He stood on the porch and he spoke through the door, and his voice was calm and conversational and reasonable. The voice of a man who has thought about what he is going to say for a long time before he says it. He said, Ranger, I know you are awake. I would like to talk with you. I did not answer. He said, my name is Mercer. I have been here a long time. I am not going to come into your cabin. I am going to stand here on the porch and talk to you, and then I am going to leave. Will you listen? I said, why are there packs at your cabin? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Because I brought them out. I said, out from where? He said, from the bottom of the talus slope above Caswell Mine. They climbed a chute that was wet. The woman fell first and the man went down after her. He went down to help her. They were both alive when I got there, but not for long. The chute drops about 200 feet onto granite. I could not get them out by myself. I am 68 years old and I weigh 140 pounds. I dragged them off the talus into the trees and I covered them, and I brought their packs back to my cabin because I was going to walk them out to your station as soon as the storms passed. I have been a long way from anyone for a long time, Ranger, and I do not move as fast as I used to. I said, why did you not light a signal fire? Why did you not come out then? He said, I do not come out. I have not come out in 41 years. There are reasons for that, and they are mine. I was going to bring the packs to your station. I was going to leave them on your porch and walk away. I did not know that you had seen my camps. I did not know that you had been up Pistol Creek. When I saw you on the path yesterday, I went to look at your cabin, and I took some coffee because I was tired, and I had been awake for 3 days. I brought the coffee back tonight because I did not want you to think it was a thing I did. I am very sorry to have frightened you, Ranger. I do not want anything from you. I want to bring you the packs and tell you where the bodies are, and then I want to go back to my cabin and not see another man for the rest of my life. Can we do that? I said, you called my name through the window 2 nights ago. There was a long silence on the other side of the door. He said, I did not call your name, Ranger. I said, you did, at about 3 in the morning. You said it twice. He said, I was at my cabin at 3 in the morning 2 nights ago. I was 19 miles by trail from yours. I did not call your name. I do not know your name. I have never known your name. We stood on either side of the door for a long time. The river ran behind the cabin. The wind came through the firs. I tried very hard to make him be lying. I could not. He said, Ranger, I am going to put the packs on the porch. I am going to give you the coordinates of the bodies. I am going to walk back to my cabin. You may send the marshals after me if you wish. They will not find me. They have not found me for 41 years. I would prefer that you did not send them. I am going to write the coordinates on a piece of paper, and I am going to leave it on top of the packs. Do you understand? I understood. I heard him set the packs down. I heard him fold a piece of paper. I heard the porch boards as he stepped down and walked across the clearing and into the trees. I waited until the sky began to gray. Then I opened the door. The packs were on the porch, the blue and the red, stacked one on top of the other. The piece of paper was folded on top. The coordinates were written in a careful copperplate hand, the kind of handwriting they used to teach in country schools. The location was an unnamed talus chute below the Caswell Mine, 1,500 feet up the east wall of Upper Pistol Creek. The marshals came in by helicopter at 10 in the morning. I gave them the coordinates. They sent a roped team in, and they recovered the bodies of Adelaide Pike and Brennan Voss from the bottom of the chute, exactly where Mercer had said they would be. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a fall of approximately 180 feet. There was no sign of foul play on the bodies. The marshals went up Pistol Creek to the cabin. The cabin was empty. The garden had been turned under. The clothesline was bare. The cookware was gone. The cabin had been stripped to the walls in the few hours between Mercer's visit to my porch and the arrival of the marshals. They processed it for prints and DNA. They found neither. They issued a federal warrant for a man known to them only as Mercer, age approximately 68, last seen by a federal employee on the porch of a Park Service cabin on the Middle Fork of the Salmon. The warrant remains active. He has not been seen. I finished the season. Halloran did not fire me. He did not even argue when I told him I would not be coming back the next year. He stood in his office at McCall on my last day, and he looked at me with those pale eyes, and he said, "You did the job. You found the dead, and you brought back the dead. There is no shame in not wanting to do it again." I drove out of McCall in the 3rd week of September with the truck packed and the rifle in the rack behind the seat. I went south, and I did not stop until I was through Boise and into the desert beyond. I do not live in the mountains now. I do not work for the federal government. I think about the cabin on the Middle Fork sometimes, and the cairn that was built behind it in the rain, and the voice that called my name through the open window at 3 in the morning, and I do not know whose voice it was because Mercer's voice was not the voice that called. There are people in the River of No Return who are not on any map. There is no fence around the wilderness. There is no roster of the men who walked into it 40 or 60 or 80 years ago and never walked out. They are an unknown number, and they are a quiet number, and most of them mean no harm. But not all of them are Mercer. And the canyons up there are wide, and the side drainages are many. And a man who has lived alone in the forest for a very long time does not always remain the man he was when he walked in. I think about that sometimes. I think about it more than I should. I never went back. The job listing on the Forest Service website did not mention that the Chamberlain Basin Station sat 90 miles from the nearest paved road. It did not mention that the only way in, once the snow shut down the airstrip, was a 2-day pack trip on horseback through some of the most forbidding country in the continental United States. It mentioned a salary, a housing stipend, seasonal benefits, and a phone number to call if you had wilderness experience and a clean background check. I had neither, but I had 3 months of unpaid rent stacked on my kitchen counter and a foreclosure notice taped to my apartment door in Spokane. And that is how a man named Masca Whitebear, 38 years old, a former regional auditor for a mid-sized logistics company, came to be standing on a dirt strip in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness with a duffel bag at his feet and the sound of a Cessna 206 fading off behind a ridge that looked like the back of a sleeping animal. I want to be honest about why I took the job. It was not romance. It was not a love of the outdoors, though I had grown up camping with my father along the Coeur d'Alene River and I knew which end of a compass pointed north. It was money. My wife had left 2 years earlier, taking what was left of our savings and most of our furniture, and I had stayed on at the firm out of inertia until the firm itself dissolved during the second wave of layoffs. The recruiter for the Forest Service was a woman in Missoula who told me, without any softness, that the Chamberlain station was understaffed because nobody wanted to be there. The previous ranger had quit in August, 3 months into his contract, citing what he called personal reasons. The position offered room and board, a stipend large enough to cover my back rent if I lived simply, and a guarantee of solitude. I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday and was on a plane to Salmon, Idaho by Friday. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness covers 2.5 million acres, which is larger than the state of Delaware. It is, by most measures, the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48, and Chamberlain Basin sits roughly in the middle of it, a high meadow surrounded by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, with the Chamberlain Creek running through it and a small lake called Mosquito Lake about 3/4 of a mile to the east. The station itself is a one-room log cabin built in 1934, expanded with an attached shed in the 1960s, equipped with a wood stove, a propane refrigerator, a hand pump for water, and a single satellite phone that worked, when it worked, only between the hours of about 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. There is no electricity, there is no cellular service. The nearest other human being during the off-season is a backcountry outfitter named Roy who runs a mule string out of Cabin Creek, 27 miles to the south as the crow flies and considerably farther by trail. My supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Eli Two Crows who worked out of the McCall office, flew in with me for the first week. He showed me the station, the trails, the chain of custody for incident reports, the protocol for backcountry medical events, and the radio routine such as it was. Every evening at 1800 hours, I was to make a check-in call to dispatch on the satellite phone. If I missed 2 consecutive check-ins, a flight would be scheduled within 48 hours, weather permitting. He repeated those last 2 words, weather permitting, in the same way a man might say if I am still alive. He showed me where the bear spray was, where the rifle was, where the first aid kit was, and where the previous ranger had left a handwritten journal in the top drawer of the desk. He told me not to read the journal. I asked why. He said the previous ranger had been a romantic and his writing reflected it. He said I would do better to keep my own counsel. I nodded and put the journal in the bottom drawer without opening it. On the seventh day, Eli left. I watched the small plane lift off from the grass strip and bank east toward the Salmon River, and then I watched the sky for a long time after it was gone because it was the last thing that had moved in that direction in a way that was not animal or wind. The silence that settled over Chamberlain Basin after that plane was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It was not the absence of sound. The creek was running, the wind was moving the tops of the pines, a raven was calling somewhere off in the timber. But it was the absence of human sound, of engine noise, of voices, of the low hum that I had not realized accompanied every minute of my previous life. I stood on the porch of the cabin for nearly an hour before I went back inside and started making my own dinner. The first 3 weeks were uneventful in a way that I began to suspect was a kind of test. I patrolled the trails close to the station, walked the perimeter of Mosquito Lake, checked the registration box at the main trailhead, recorded the names of the 4 or 5 backcountry parties who came through. I split firewood, I read books from the shelf that previous rangers had left. I made my radio calls on time. The work was simple, the loneliness was not. By the third week, I had begun talking to myself, narrating my own movements, asking myself questions and answering them, and I had to make a deliberate decision to stop because I could feel the habit becoming a thing I would not be able to shake when I returned to people. It was at the end of that third week, on a Thursday evening, that I heard the voice for the first time. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light fail over the meadow, and somewhere out past the tree line I heard a man call out a single word. It sounded like hello. It was faint, and it could have been any number of natural things: an elk bugle starting up wrong, a coyote yipping through a strange acoustic pocket, a bird I did not recognize. I stood up, set the coffee down, and listened. I waited 5 full minutes. Nothing came back. I went inside, made my radio check, and did not put it in the report. The lost hiker call came in on a Monday morning in early September. A man named Daxon Vereen, 51 years old, from Boise, had been overdue from a solo 6-day loop out of the Big Creek trailhead for 36 hours. His wife had reported him missing on Saturday. The Forest Service had run an aerial search on Sunday with no results. On Monday morning, Eli called me on the satellite phone and asked me to take a string of mules from Roy's outfit, ride to the Acorn Butte area on the south end of the basin, and search the drainages along his planned route. 2 other rangers would be coming in from the south. I should expect to be in the field for 3 to 4 days. I rode out at noon with Roy himself accompanying me because the mules belonged to him and he would not let them go alone. Roy was 60-something, bearded, talked very little, and had spent more time in the Frank church than most rangers had spent in their own kitchens. He had outfitted hunting trips in the basin since the 1980s. As we rode south along the Chamberlain Creek Trail, he told me he had seen Daxon Vereen come through Cabin Creek the previous week. He said the man had looked competent, well-equipped, in good shape, and had asked intelligent questions about water sources. He said he was not the kind of person who got lost. I asked Roy what kind of person did. He thought about it for a while and said, in his experience, the people who got lost in that country were almost always people who got hurt first. We made camp the first night at a meadow called Hand Creek, about 12 miles south of the station. Roy built a small fire, and we ate canned chili and rice, and after the sun went down, he told me a story I asked him not to repeat. He said that in 1987 he had been guiding a hunting trip in the same drainage we were now sitting in, and one of his clients, a man from Texas, had walked out of camp at night to relieve himself and had not come back. They searched for him for 6 days. They found his rifle leaning against a tree about 100 yards from camp. They never found him. Roy said the official conclusion was that the man had become disoriented in the dark and walked off a cut bank into the creek. I asked him if he believed that. He said he believed something like that. Then he said goodnight and rolled into his bag. The second day we rode south and west into the country around Acorn Butte, and that afternoon around 4 o'clock we found Daxon Vereen's pack. It was leaning against the base of a Douglas fir about a quarter-mile off the main trail in a small clearing where someone had clearly stopped to rest. The pack was intact. His sleeping bag was still rolled and strapped to the top. His water filter was in the side pocket. His food was untouched. His map was inside the lid, folded and marked with a red pencil. The only thing missing was a small fanny pack he was known to have carried, which his wife had described as containing his wallet, a camera, and a satellite messenger device. The messenger device had not transmitted in 3 days. We radioed in our find on a portable unit Roy carried, and within an hour the two rangers from the south, a woman named Hema Nightroad and a man named Ozawindib Charles, were riding into our position from the west. We made a search base at the clearing and began a grid pattern out from the pack location, calling Daxon's name, marking trees with surveyor's tape. We searched until full dark, and then we slept, briefly and badly, and we started again at first light. It was on the second day of searching, the third day of the operation, that I heard the voice again. We had spread out across a broad slope of mixed timber, each of us within shouting distance of the next, working a transect line toward a creek drainage that ran east. I was on the far right of the line, closest to a low ridge of broken rock. The other rangers were calling Daxon's name every minute or two. I was calling it too, and somewhere around 11 in the morning, after I had called his name perhaps 50 times that morning, I heard, from somewhere up the slope to my right, a voice call back. It said, very clearly, "I'm here." It said it once, it did not repeat. I stopped walking. I stood absolutely still. I waited. I called out, "Daxon, keep calling, I am coming to you." Nothing came back. I called out again. Nothing. I moved up the slope toward where I thought the voice had come from, climbing for perhaps 10 minutes, until I came to a small, flat shelf of rock above the timber. There was no one there. There were no tracks. There was no sign of anyone having been there. I called out again in every direction and got no response. After half an hour, I worked my way back down to the line and continued the search. I did not tell the others. I told myself I had been hearing what I wanted to hear, which is a known phenomenon during search and rescue operations, particularly under stress and fatigue. I told myself that the human brain, when listening intently for a specific sound, will manufacture that sound out of ambient noise. There is even a name for it, pareidolia of the auditory kind, the same trick that makes us hear words in the static of a radio. I told myself this, and I almost believed it until that evening when we made camp again, and Hema mentioned very casually that she had heard someone shouting earlier in the day from up on the ridge, but she had assumed it was me. We found Daxon Vereen the next morning at the bottom of a 30-foot cliff in a side drainage of the creek. He had a compound fracture of the left femur and was hypothermic but alive. He had been there for 5 days. He could not remember how he had fallen. He had no memory of leaving his pack. When we asked him if he had been calling out for help, he said he had not had the strength to call for the last 3 days. He had been lying on his back at the bottom of the cliff, trying to stay warm and waiting to die. The helicopter that flew Daxon out also took Hema and Ozawindib back to McCall. Roy and I rode the mules back to the station. We did not talk much. I think we were both turning over the same questions, and neither of us wanted to say them out loud. When Roy left me at Chamberlain on the afternoon of the 5th day, he stood for a long moment looking out at the meadow, and then he said, without looking at me, that if I started to hear things at night, I should not go outside to investigate, and I should not, under any circumstance, answer back. He did not explain. He climbed on his lead mule and rode south. For the next 2 weeks, the basin was quiet. I made my patrols. I made my radio calls. I went to sleep at full dark and woke at first light. The aspens along the creek had begun to turn yellow, and in the mornings there was frost on the porch. I told myself the season was almost over. I told myself I had less than 5 weeks until I would be flown out and could go home with money in the bank and the worst of it behind me. It was on a Tuesday in mid-September, around 2 in the morning, that I awoke to the sound of my own name. I was lying in the bunk in the back corner of the cabin, and I heard from somewhere outside a man's voice say very clearly, "Masca." It was not a shout. It was a conversational tone, as if the speaker were standing on the porch with his hand on the doorknob. I lay perfectly still. I waited for it to come again. After perhaps 2 minutes it did. The same voice, the same word, Masca, a pause. Then, almost gently, wake up. I did not move. I did not breathe for a long moment. I went through in my head every reasonable explanation, a delirium dream still cresting in my mind, a coyote, a neighbor I did not have, the wind across the eaves. I knew in the way one knows things in the middle of the night that none of these was correct, and I knew also that Roy had told me not to answer, and I knew that I was not going to answer. I lay in that bunk for what felt like an hour and was probably 20 minutes, and the voice came twice more, each time saying my name and then waiting as if for a response that did not come. Then it stopped, and I heard nothing else until first light. In the morning, I went out onto the porch with the rifle, and I walked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no tracks. There was no sign of any human presence. The dust on the porch boards had not been disturbed. I walked out to the tree line, perhaps 50 yards, and looked back at the cabin, and that was when I saw the impression in the meadow grass. A single oval flattening, about the size of a man, perhaps 40 feet from the porch. It could have been an elk bed. It looked, to my eye, more like the place a man had sat for some hours. I made my radio check that morning at 10, and I did not mention the voice. I told myself it had been a dream. I told myself that the impression in the grass was an elk bed and that the timing was a coincidence. I went about my work, but I checked the windows 3 times that day, and I brought the rifle into the cabin at sundown instead of leaving it in the shed. The next night I heard the voice again, at about the same hour. This time it was not my name, it was the sound of a woman crying. It came from somewhere out past the corral, faint but clear, and it went on for nearly 10 minutes. I sat up in the bunk and I listened. The crying had the unmistakable shape of human grief, the broken intake of breath, the small choking sounds. It was either a woman in serious distress or an exceptional imitation of one. I did not go outside. I sat in the bunk with the rifle across my lap, and I did not move until the crying stopped. When it stopped suddenly, mid-breath, as if a switch had been turned off. The third night was the worst. I had set up a small voice-activated digital recorder on the porch, a cheap device I had brought with me out of an old habit from my audit job, where I had used it for site visits. I set it in a corner of the porch under the eave, partially covered by a rag so it would not be obvious. I went to bed. I did not hear anything that night. In the morning I checked the recorder, and it had captured 3 audio events between midnight and 3 in the morning. The first was, again, my name, spoken by a man's voice. The second was the sound of someone walking on the porch, 3 distinct footsteps and a pause. The third was a different voice, higher pitched, possibly female, saying what sounded like, "He's not coming out." After that, nothing. I played the recordings back 4 times. The voices were not mine. The footsteps were not mine. I had been asleep in the cabin during all 3 events. I sat at the desk for a long time after that, with the recorder in my hand, trying to think clearly. Whatever this was, it was not auditory hallucination. It was not a dream. There were at least 2 people, possibly more, coming to the station at night, walking on my porch, speaking my name, and then leaving. They had done this for at least 3 nights. They had not tried to enter the cabin. They had not damaged anything. They had not stolen anything. They wanted me to know they were there, and they wanted me to come outside, and I had not come outside, and at some point they were going to do something else. I made the radio call at 10, and I asked Eli to schedule a flight to extract me at the end of the week. I told him I had a family emergency. I did not tell him about the voices. I did not tell him about the recordings. I did not, in that moment, want to be the second ranger that year to quit Chamberlain Basin 3 months in. I told myself I would tell him in person when the plane came, and I would play the recordings for him, and he would know what to do. The plane was scheduled for Friday morning. It was Tuesday. On Wednesday, I did something I should not have done. I went looking for them. I told myself I was conducting a patrol. I told myself it was within my duties to investigate signs of unauthorized human activity in the basin. I packed a day kit, took the rifle, took the satellite phone, and rode out at first light on the chestnut gelding the previous ranger had left behind, a steady animal named Brick. I rode north and west, following the contour of the creek upstream, watching the ground for tracks. The meadow grass was high and frosted in the morning shadow. I saw deer tracks, I saw elk tracks, I saw the prints of a single coyote that had crossed the trail in the night. I saw, after about an hour, the boot prints of a man, two sets, walking together, heading north along the same line I was now riding. The prints were not fresh. They were perhaps 2 days old, the edges softened by frost. They led me up the drainage of a small tributary called Lodgepole Creek and into a thick stand of timber where the trail thinned and then disappeared. I dismounted and tied Brick to a tree and continued on foot. The boot prints were intermittent on the harder ground, but I could follow them in patches of soft soil, and they led me, after perhaps 40 minutes of careful walking, to the edge of a small clearing that I had not known existed. In the clearing was a structure. It was not a cabin, it was not a tent. It was a kind of low, sod-roofed dugout, built into the side of a small rise, with a stovepipe sticking out of the top and a single canvas flap door. Around it were several other smaller structures, a pole shed, a small corral with no animals in it, a frame for stretching hides. There were the remains of a fire pit in the center of the clearing, the ashes cold. There was a wooden rack with what looked like elk meat drying in strips. There was a kerosene lamp hanging from a hook outside the dugout door. There was no one in sight. I stood at the edge of the timber for perhaps 10 minutes, watching, and I did not see any movement. I did not hear any sound except the wind in the trees. I unslung the rifle and I walked, slowly and deliberately, out into the clearing, calling out, "Hello, Forest Service, anyone here?" Nothing answered. I crossed to the dugout door and I knocked on the frame. Nothing. I pushed the canvas flap aside with the barrel of the rifle and I looked in. The interior was dark and smelled of wood smoke and old grease, and the unmistakable closeness of long human occupation. There was a small wood stove. There was a homemade bunk with a pile of blankets. There was a table with a kerosene lantern, a tin cup, and a stack of paperback books. There were shelves cut into the earth walls, stacked with canned goods, jars of preserved meat, a coffee can full of what looked like cash, a stack of mail addressed to a name I did not recognize at a post office box in Boise. There was, on the floor near the bunk, a small dark device that I recognized after a moment as a portable audio recorder, the kind hunters used to play coyote calls. Next to it was a pair of headphones, a notebook, and a stack of small cassette tapes, each one labeled in pencil. I picked up the top one. It was labeled M, Name, Several. I picked up another. It was labeled M, Woman Crying, 6 Men. I stood in that dugout with that cassette in my hand, and I understood. There was no mystery. There was no ghost. There was no animal making sounds it could not make. There was a man, or more than one, living in the basin, off the grid, illegally, in a structure he had built without authorization on Forest Service land. And he had been recording sounds, building a library of sounds, and he had been coming to the cabin at night and playing those sounds through a speaker, calling my name, making a woman cry, making me afraid, trying to drive me out. I did not know why. I had a guess. The drying meat, the cash, the mail. He was probably poaching, possibly running some kind of operation that depended on the basin being unmonitored. The previous ranger had quit. Maybe this man had driven him out the same way. Maybe he was trying to drive me out. I did not stay in the dugout. I took 2 of the cassettes and the notebook and I put them in my coat. I left everything else. I walked back to Brick and I rode back to the station as fast as the trail would allow, and I did not look behind me, though I wanted to very badly every step of the way. It was getting dark when I got back to Chamberlain. I put Brick in the corral. I went into the cabin. I locked the door, which I had never locked before. I set the rifle by the bed. I did not eat dinner. I sat at the desk and I opened the notebook and I read it. The notebook was a list, page after page of dates, sounds, locations, and observations. It went back to 2019. There were entries about the previous ranger. There were entries about hunters who had come through the basin. There were entries about Roy. There were entries more recent about me, dating to my first week at the station. He had been watching me since I arrived. He had noted what time I made my radio calls. He had noted what time I went to bed. He had noted that I had not come outside the first 3 times he had called my name. The last entry was dated 2 days earlier. It said only, "Decide by Friday." I did not sleep that night. I sat in the bunk with the rifle across my lap and I watched the door. And at about 1 in the morning I heard footsteps on the porch. They were not careful. They were not the soft, testing footsteps of the previous nights. They walked the length of the porch, paused at the door, and then the door handle turned. The door was locked. The handle turned a second time. There was a pause. Then a voice, very close to the door, said my name, Masca. A pause. "I know you're awake. Come out and talk to me." I did not answer. I did not move. I sat with the rifle pointed at the door and I waited. After a long minute, the voice spoke again. It said, "I am not going to hurt you. I just want to talk. I will be at the corral. Come out when you are ready." Then the footsteps walked back across the porch and down the steps and away across the meadow grass. I sat in the bunk for another hour. Then, because I knew I had to do something, and because I knew that waiting until Friday with this man circling the cabin every night was not survivable in any meaningful sense, I made a plan. I would not go to the corral. I would not open the door. I would wait until first light when I could see, and then I would take the satellite phone and the rifle and I would ride south toward Roy's outfit and I would not come back. I did exactly that. I left the cabin at 5 in the morning with the eastern sky just beginning to gray. I saddled Brick in the dark, by feel. I rode out of the basin on the south trail at a fast walk, the rifle across the saddle, the satellite phone in my coat. I did not see anyone. I did not hear anyone. The trail was empty. I made the satellite call from a ridge about 4 miles south of the station, the first place I had a clear sky. I reached Eli on the second try. I told him everything in about 90 seconds. I told him about the voices. I told him about the recordings. I told him about the dugout and the man in the notebook. I told him I was riding to Cabin Creek and I would meet the plane there. He told me to keep moving, that he would have a deputy from Valley County and 2 Forest Service law enforcement officers on the next flight in. I made Cabin Creek by sundown. Roy was on the porch of his outfitter cabin when I rode in. He looked at me and at the rifle and at the lather on Brick, and he did not ask me anything. He took the horse to his corral and he poured me a cup of coffee and he sat me down at his kitchen table and he waited. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said very quietly, "He's the one who took Vincent." I asked who Vincent was. He said Vincent was the man from Texas, the hunter in 1987, the one whose rifle they had found against the tree. He said he had always known the man had not walked off a cut bank. He had always known someone had been living up in those drainages. He had just never been able to prove it. The Forest Service flew in 2 days later. The deputies and law enforcement officers went up to the basin with Roy as a guide. They found the dugout exactly where I had told them it was. The man was not in it. He had taken most of his belongings, the recorder, the cash, the mail, and gone. They found in a pit dug under the floor of the pole shed the partially preserved remains of a man, later identified through dental records as Vincent Strake, missing since 1987. They found other things in that pit too, things that I will not write here because I do not want them in my head any more than they already are. The man was never caught. His name, based on the mail in the dugout, was a Carol Underwood, but it was almost certainly an alias, and the post office box in Boise had been rented under a false identification. The Forest Service believes he had been living in the Frank Church wilderness for at least 15 years, possibly longer. moving between several different shelters he had built across hundreds of square miles of country. They believe he had driven out at least 2 previous rangers at Chamberlain and probably contributed to the death of at least one hiker whose case had been ruled a backcountry accident. They believe he is still out there, somewhere in the 2.5 million acres of that wilderness, and that he will live and die there without ever being found. I did not return to Chamberlain. The Forest Service paid out my contract in full and offered me a position at a developed campground near McCall the following spring. I took it for a season and then I left the agency. I work now as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Boise. My office has fluorescent lights and a window that looks out on a parking lot, and I am grateful for it every day. The cassettes are in a fireproof safe in my apartment. I have never played them. I do not need to. I know what is on them. I know that somewhere in that library of sounds is the voice of Vincent Strake calling for help, recorded the night he died and saved and used for 40 years by the man who killed him to draw other men out of cabins at night. I know also that my name is on one of those tapes and that wherever Carol Underwood is now, in whatever new corner of that wilderness he has dug himself into, he can still, whenever he chooses, sit down at his table by the light of a kerosene lamp and put on the headphones and listen to me. And I know with a certainty that I cannot fully justify and cannot fully escape that he is doing exactly that tonight, and that someday on a trail somewhere I will not be expecting, he will be waiting for me to call out his name.